Hopefully you can hear us and see us, and everything's going to sound beautiful. And I am back this week. Josh held it down not only with a live show on Saturday night, but also with some live previews. We're doing a little something different this week, kind of letting that 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern, 7:30-ish game get to the end before we start our show, because I think that, Josh, a lot of people are watching those games and they don't necessarily want to hear us doing play-by-play, and it just makes it hard for us. Looks like Josh might even have a haircut while I was gone. Big haircut. Josh, let's talk about the Bama game since it just ended. We probably won't spend too much time on this one tonight because there's a lot of interesting games today. Bama defense really kind of stepped up in a way that you might think is amazing, but in general, they've never struggled with Mike Leach's, offense. For me, what was concerning, if I'm an Alabama fan, is how bad Bryce Young looked tonight. And people are going to want me to say Bill O'Brien. I'm not saying Bill O'Brien. Bryce Young looked terrible tonight. And I want you to talk about two possibilities. I have one theory that it might be his shoulder flaring up. The other is a rush 3 drop 8 scenario with Bryce Young, or a situation where he knows he's got a lot of protection and all day to throw, is a situation that's bad for him, because I think that he operates when he's going on tempo and he's throwing really quickly, and not so much where he can sit back there all day because he's trying to make this hero perfect throw. One of those two things I think was happening, but either way, it wasn't a great night for Alabama's offense.
Yeah, and the first thing I'll note is they're 1.1 yards per carry. They only had 29 rushing yards in the game. So if you want to talk about things that didn't help, the complete inability to run the football definitely makes things more challenging. But I do think Bryce Young is something of a wizard when he's creating and when he's in a pressure situation where he has to throw the football. But when he's in a situation where he feels like he has time, he tends to sit and just hold the ball and hold the ball and hold the ball. And there's a point in that broadcast where they talked about he had something like 10.3 seconds to release the football. And, that's great in theory, but as a quarterback, you have to understand that you don't really have 10.3 seconds to throw a football in a game. And I think that is a problem that Bryce Young has, that he tends to be somewhat maybe overcautious. There are windows that he has on some of those later plays where he could throw the football to an open receiver. Maybe it's worth, 7-yard completion. It's not a huge window, but he tends just to not to take those opportunities sometimes when he has the protection to do it and it's early in a progression. He feels like, I can wait for something bigger to come open. And the problem is those routes sort of run their course and it doesn't come open. And then at that point, you're just waiting on scramble rolls. So I do agree with you. I think it is a significant flaw in Bryce Young's game. But I also think he did miss more throws than we've seen. And that probably is a reflection of a shoulder. It's only so much you can say. I think they have a bye week next week. And you look at Mississippi State stats, which I have up right now. They had 3.9 yards per attempt and 2.4 yards per carry. For all the angst about Alabama's pass defense, we talked about a lot last week, and I talked about a little bit. I think I did a preview of this game. I did. It's kind of hard for me to remember everything I've done. Scheme matters a lot. Alabama had particular issues with the very particular scheme that Tennessee ran and how vertical it was. They made changes again at personnel, bringing in Eli Ricks, who was a preseason All-American at corner. I assume at this point he just finally understood the defense, or he had an injury. It's hard to tell. But they look like a completely different unit versus that Mississippi State offense. And yeah, Mississippi State moved the ball some, but from a per play sense, they were just absolute garbage, honestly. But to your point, I think Alabama probably should have scored a lot more in the game. This was a good defensive effort and a pretty miserable offensive effort. There's not a whole lot more I can really take out of it, honestly, because that was just kind of a boring sleeper of a game.
Yeah, it really kind of looked like to me that Alabama was playing like a team whose defense was pissed off and whose offense is really wanting a bye week. Benjamin V coming in with a super chat. Daniel, hope you had a good trip. Does Michigan State have any chance against Michigan? Never easy for Michigan, but also seems like the talent gap is too wide this year. I did have a good trip, although I will say taking a 3, 5, and 7-year-old with your wife to Disney and then a cruise is not so much vacation as you'd think. So I think that Michigan beats Michigan State pretty bad this year. If I'm being honest, I do think the talent gap is an issue. I think scheme is an issue. I think Michigan State also, like, I know people want to say rivalry games, throw the books, the record books out the window, but Michigan State last year was in a lot different place mentally than they are coming into this one. A little bit defeated, and I don't see it. They're not going to sneak up on Michigan in any kind of way. Killtag9 says Eli Ricks did seem like he was playing pretty well. Seemed like they were targeting him, but his energy seemed like something Bama could use. Eli Ricks had some injury. I think he had the back injury in camp, and then there was some issues that people were saying that he was, coming from LSU and really a man-heavy scheme, that he had trouble sort of learning that defense, and that's why he was not on the field, not because of talent. Tonight, it seemed like they just said, look, we're going to line you up. You're going to cover somebody, and he did. I mean, and you're right, the energy was something different than we've seen from the Bama secondary. I think all of them played with a different energy tonight in a way that we haven't seen this year. And McKinstry looked good too, to me as well. I was surprised that Mississippi State didn't try to exploit a little bit in the same way with matchups, but you got to run your offense, and you are who you are at that point. I want to talk a little bit about Iowa, Ohio State before we get into some of these other games. And I know that there's a bunch of Ohio State fans in the chat. And initially, and sorry, we're going to do them with a few technical issues here, but I think Josh is coming back. I was really, and we've been on this Iowa offense issue thing for the whole season. Brian Ferentz, nepotism city. They're the 99th best scoring offense last year. He got a $50,000 raise. They've been an absolute joke this year, and it was comical what they were doing in an Ohio State game, and a lot of it was unforced. But Josh, I would like you to weigh in on this a little bit, because even when an offense is terrible, it's still good, in my opinion, that Ohio State held a standard the entire game. And, they gave up 3 points. It was like, I think they had 8 first downs and 6 turnovers. 7 turnovers if you count the punt, the fake punt. And then 3 of those first downs, one was penalty aided, and the other 2 were against prevent. So basically more turnovers than first downs. Josh, at some point, people are going to diminish this defensive effort from Ohio State, but I feel like in years past, even against bad offenses, Ohio State would have still given up 17, 21 points. Maybe let the ground game get going or something for the other team, and they just didn't do that today.
Yeah, no, Ohio State really shut him down. So I think the first thing you have to talk about, and Yum Yums put a super chat out there just to say, please use this time to rant about Brian Ferentz. And I imagine you'll have some ranting yourself, but I'll sort of note some statistics from this game. QBR. Now, I will say ESPN's QBR, a bit of a broken trick. It's a balance between value of running and value passing, and there's clearly some problems with the way it's calculated. But still, CJ Stroud, a QBR of 60.3. McCord's QBR, 86.9. Texas QBR, 3.5. Padilla, 1.8. I don't know that I've ever seen a QBR of less than 5 from a starting quarterback in a football game. And I mean that literally. I don't know that I've ever seen that before from a P5 quarterback. Iowa had 158 yards in the game. And at some point, if you're shutting someone down to that degree, then you're playing good defense. And I will say at times Iowa could run the ball a little bit, and it was a little baffling to me why in the world Iowa ever even tried to pass, because it's when you talk about the indictment with the quarterback situation and whatnot, like, look, they had some guys they could have made some tough completions, and they would just throw the ball 4 yards over their head or like at their feet. Like, the ball wasn't really within the realm of catchable on out routes and things like that. It looked like guys, probably including myself, that have played intramurals and like in college, that it's lucky if they make a completion. That's kind of what they look like as an offense. But when they did get some things going and they ran the ball, a couple times for what their rushing long was 18 yards. It wasn't like a ton. Even then, Ohio State generally shut them down, and their depth really showed up throughout the game and continued to have them shut down well after the point where Ohio State no longer considered themselves to be in a competitive game. And that's what elite teams do. I mean, they play at a high level the whole game, and they shut people down and they show their ability to do so. Daniel, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but for all that Ohio State did, I think defensively, I was concerned with Ohio State offensively. They run the ball 30 carries for 66 yards, a little over 2 yards a carry. CJ Stroud ends with a good stat line, but if you watch that game, you'd know he really kind of got into rhythm late when Iowa was beaten down and kind of gave up. But for about half, 2/3 of the way through the game, when Iowa was competing, that offense was out of rhythm. Guys were not open. Things weren't clicking. I know Smith and Jigba was banged up, went to the sidelines, but it was a little concerning for me to see their offense really in the second game they've played against a good defense sputter for the second time. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, and Mike Farino with Super Chat said something similar. How's it going, y'all? This game was weird. It's almost as if Ohio State's offense is better when they don't have a short field. And I do think that that's part of it. Look, I think Iowa's got a great defense. So from that standpoint, I think that, this goes back to my frustration, and Big Ten fans, Ohio State fans don't want to hear it, but this is yet again a time where Ohio State's offense has sputtered, and the offense on the other side of the ball was so bad that they couldn't take advantage of it. And so it's frustrating to me that we don't get to see Ohio State play a good offense until the postseason, until the playoffs, until a bowl game. That's frustrating. And look, the Big Ten's got to do something about this in terms of like quarterback recruiting, offensive, scheme development, something, because it is bland, boring, old man football from the early Nick Saban era. Ohio State's not that. And they figured it out in the second half. But I do think that the short fields sort of compressed what they want to do, because they do want to do a lot of verticality, a lot of deep shots, even, just stuff in space. They did figure it out though, Josh. And that's the thing, is like when it's not your day offensively, you can figure it out. And I also wonder if they were trying stuff because they knew that Iowa just wasn't going to get it done. Padilla, like you said, he had a 1.8 whatever QBR. They finally put him in, and he had 2 turnovers on 2 plays, like a fumble and then an interception. And to me, this speaks to coaching, because yes, you might have a quarterback who's not great in Spencer Petras, but when the backup comes in and nobody's got any tape on him, nobody's got any film on him, and he's just as bad, and they're not scheming him any easy throws, Josh, some of this is just bad coaching. And some of this is just, I don't know what you do, because it seems like Ferentz is going to keep his kid there forever. I mean, at what point does Iowa decide to make a move?
Yeah, I don't necessarily have an answer for you there. I will say in his defense, when we saw him trot out the backup quarterback, and I know you've been sort of on a campaign that continuing to trot out Petras was a mistake. Padilla from Oklahoma State looked worse than Petras, which is almost unfathomable, but that was the situation they're in. At some level, they just don't have a quarterback. They don't have one. They do not have a sourceable one, and the offense is just going to be in the gutter as a result. But if that's the situation you're in, you accept it, and then you play offense based on that. And it may be an offense where you're just going to line up 5 tight ends and run the ball for 3 or 4 yards a carry and hope you can get a couple first downs and wear down the other team. But that's what you do because that's all you can do. The thing that troubled me the most about Iowa is that they kept trying to go like 4 wide and throw the ball when it was real clear they can't hit the broadside of a barn. Like that's just bad. Like if it doesn't matter that that's what you want to do. If you can't do it, don't do it. Like stop. And it's kind of disturbing where they're at, and it's disturbing that we're at this point in the season. Maybe week 1 or week 2 it's forgivable, but we're past the halfway point of the year, and you haven't learned that lesson yet. That says a lot about what they're at offensively and from a coordinator perspective. Yeah, I mean, Ohio State didn't give them anything easy. They made those throws difficult. But even within that realm, right, you can have a contested pass. And that's sort of what we talk about, right? The eye test part of college football. We use models, we use analytics, but you have to actually watch the game. And the reason for that is there's an incompletion where the Ohio State quarterback breaks up the pass. And then there's an incompletion where the Ohio State quarterback's right there with the guy, and the ball is somewhere over there, like 10 feet that way. And that's what the Iowa game was. It was like, it didn't matter how close he was never catching that football. So, yeah, I don't. There's not a lot of hope there. But with the contract that they've signed for Ince to at Iowa, man, I mean they're stuck, and that's going to be a sticky situation for the rest of the year and the end of the season. Uncle Rico says, I honestly think that having Rusty JSN actually threw off OSU's passing game. Stroud was locked in on him, but once he went out, they were back in rhythm. Like, I think that's true, and I think Stroud definitely stepped up and started playing with more rhythm, and the offense got better. Stroud missed a lot of reads and a lot of throws early in this game, but this just goes to something we said, and let's be clear, this is not a unique complaint with Stroud. I don't know that there's anyone in college football this year that doesn't have this complaint. Stroud, when he gets pressure, when things aren't going right, when his first read's not there, does get a little bit rattled. He does start missing throws. He does start missing reads, and the offense bogs down to a pretty credible degree. We already talked about Bryce Young's problems and the way that he operates offensively. Yeah, and I don't know if this is the time to transition, but the other person that also kind of fits in that mold is probably Quinn Ewers. But it's not a unique problem that Stroud has. A lot of people struggle with pressure and struggle with adversity at the quarterback position. It's hard to deal with.
Yeah, and I want to talk about yours in a second. I want to ask you a strategy question, though. So Texas A&M is moving the ball down the field, down 9 points, no timeouts left, taking a lot of deep shots to try to get to the end zone because they need to get to the end zone and they need to get an onside kick. If you're South Carolina in this situation, do you not just pass interfere every play? Because deep shots take 6, 7, 8 seconds every time. Okay, give them 15 yards. They're going to have to do that. They're going to literally have to run out the clock just to throw those deep passes. I would like. It's kind of like fouling in basketball at the end of the game. Like I would just pass interfere. They'll run out of time.
Certainly, if they're throwing the ball deep, I'd pass interfere. If they're throwing it short, I might let them catch it. If the ball goes over 15 yards, just tackle the guy.
Yeah.
Give him the 15 yards. I mean, there's no reason to let the ball travel more than 15 yards in a play. I don't think you're wrong. And there was I feel like there were a couple games recently. It was the Utah UCLA or the Utah USC game, which, by the way, being someone that is a nitnoid nerd for trying to understand the rules, I still don't understand how you call a timeout in the middle of a play. No one's explained that one to me yet. I don't understand how that happened in the rules. But the same sort of thing happened that they had a pass interference and Utah intercepts the ball. And the guy, after he intercepts the ball after the clear pass interference, runs around. But the problem is the clock doesn't reset for the flag. So the whole time that he was running around with the ball just ticks off from the clock. And then the play ends, and then you give it back to him. Like if you just tackle the guy and you intercept it, and then you run around in a circle for a while, that actually just counts off against the clock the entire time. So more so than just you're talking about the pass interference. If you pass interfere intentionally, intercept the ball, and tell the guy to just run backward to the 1 yard line and take a knee, it's actually totally legal. It runs off the clock. If they decline the foul to give you the ball at the 1, you have the ball, and now they have to stop use. They're not going to do that, so they're going to accept the penalty and then just eat the time. So it is a hole in the rules that should be, I would exploit if I were a coach, but I think it also kind of needs to be patched that if there's a pass interference with, I don't know what you want to say, like under so many minutes on the clock, there's a real argument that the clock can't run after somebody touches the ball. Certainly if the ball is intercepted, the clock has to stop. But even there, right, really, I think there's an argument maybe under 30 seconds. If there's a pass interference in the play, you maybe should get the time back for the entire play. Because otherwise you can just run the clock down every play.
All right. So need to go rapid fire with some topics because we are
fun point. So you made the point here. So 2016, Clemson beats Alabama for the national title. running a rub route, right? Where they catch the ball. And they did that because they knew if they got an offensive pass interference, they would just kick the field goal anyway, which would have tied the game. So by this point, the safest thing Alabama could have done in that situation was to immediately tackle the receivers, which would have drawn a pass interference flag. But because of the time, Clemson at that point would have either had to throw to win, and if they threw to win, they would have foregone the field goal entirely. So they probably would have had to decline the flag. Interesting, or accept the flag and then kick the field goal.
Here's another bad coaching decision, in my opinion. South Carolina had 4th and 1 on Texas A&M's 7-yard line. Went for it. They were up by 9. Went for it instead of kicking the field goal to go up by 12. And now a Hail Mary can beat them. So that was pretty dumb. Okay, got to run through some of these. My favorite part of college football right now is that Illinois can still make the playoff. Not likely, but possible. That's from Quasar0121. Look, I think that's what makes college football fun, and I think that we can get into some of these discussions because sorry, I was watching that last play. We can get into some of these discussions because, there are still teams that are still in it, and there's only 4 playoff spots, so we don't have to pretend like Illinois, if they go 10-2 this year, actually belongs in the playoffs. The discussion of Oregon came up today. And look, if Oregon wins out and there's enough spots left based on what everybody else does, I'm fine with them making the playoffs. But if they don't make the playoffs, we get to look back at the fact that they lost by 46 to Georgia and understand that maybe they don't belong there. We get to look at the fact that they also almost lost to Washington State. I'm okay with us making some of these determinations based on what happened in week 1 and week 2. At some point, we have to accept this. And that's where I think that we aren't going with the playoff expansion. We're not accepting these things. But, Josh, tell me, what do we do with Oregon? What do we do with Oregon if they went out and, the Alabama-Georgia thing plays out in the SEC championship? So then we've got, if Alabama wins out and Georgia has 1 loss, you can't put Oregon in over Georgia, even if Oregon's a 1-loss conference champion, right? That's a little weird, but I don't think you can.
Yeah, I don't think so. And there are a lot of people, though, they're going to argue that Oregon is a different team than they were in week 1. And I'm sure that's already going to start popping up in the comments before I say this. There's a little bit of lag, but I'm just kind of waiting for those to show up. I don't know that that's 100% true. I mean, the reality for Oregon, yeah, I mean, they blew out UCLA. It ended up being 45-30. UCLA kind of put up a fight at the end. I've never really been a complete believer in UCLA, but you can't ignore a couple weeks ago with Washington State that was a close game. I don't think the Pac-12 very good. I don't think the Pac-12 is very good. And I know there are probably some people out there that are going to get really mad at me right now for saying that, but it's just, that's reality right now. The Pac-12 is not very good. And Oregon played Georgia, and it wasn't just that they lost. And there was a tweet we sent out, and I'm going to throw you under the bus, Daniel, and say that was your tweet. But you weren't wrong to say that if Georgia wanted to win by 70, they probably could have. And I can know people can say, well, Georgia scored every drive. Yeah, Georgia scored every drive, but they did it running the ball and just killing the clock for a half. They weren't really trying to score. It was just, let's see how fast we can burn this clock. And even in that mode, Oregon couldn't stop them. They were so outmatched, laughably so. So this gets into the greater playoff conversation that we have, this idea that every conference champion has to be included. Well, if that's Oregon, I am pretty darn confident that Oregon has absolutely no shot competitively to play with Georgia and Alabama and Ohio State and Michigan in a playoff and win a playoff. They've got no shot. Not only, you can talk about the fact of whether or not they deserve it for playing Georgia. And there are a lot of people that say, well, if we just hadn't played Georgia, we would have been in anyway. Well, that's a crappy argument, because at that point, all you're saying is, if you hadn't played Georgia, we wouldn't know that we have absolutely no shot of winning a playoff.
Right.
The reality here is, no, it's not really even the deservedness factor. It's the fact that I've already seen you play a team of that caliber, and athletically, you were so outmatched. I have zero confidence that you can put up a game against an end of the season playoff SEC team or Big Ten team. It's just not going to happen.
And it's the clean
and that's
record.
my problem with Oregon.
It's the clean record fallacy. Like, we want to assume all clean records are the same, and we don't want to dive into the fact that the Pac-12 was 3-7 this year against Power 5 competition, which 3-7, if you do the math, means two teams didn't even play Power 5 opponents. Now, UCLA was one of them. UCLA played 3 tomato cans to open the season. They got canceled by Michigan. That would have been a great data point to have. This is why we harp on this so much about Power 5 out of conference scheduling. This is why we love what Ohio State does. We love what Texas does. Clemson, Georgia, these are teams that schedule brand names out of conference. You can't help if that brand name sucks in a given year, but if you dominate them or you lose to them, this is information. So if UCLA got absolutely murdered by Michigan, and they go in and they're a one-loss team, but running the table in the Pac-12 before they play Oregon, we know we have so much data now to know that whoever wins that game has to win by default, but it's not necessarily a big win. The Pac-12 3-7 against Power 5 opponents out of conference plus Notre Dame. One was that 16-14 win last week from Stanford over Notre Dame. Wisconsin lost by 3, I think, to Washington State, and Wisconsin's a bad football team this year. So we have nothing to assume that Pac-12 is good. They circle the wagons, and every week a Pac-12 team plays another Pac-12 team. Somebody has to get a win. We've got to get away from this assumption that means it's good, and that's why I kind of hope that it comes down to Georgia maybe not winning the SEC championship game, being 12-1 or whatever, and Oregon winning the Pac-12, because I really want these conference champions belonging in the playoff people to come out of the woodwork and give me the argument why Oregon belongs in over Georgia, having lost by 46.
Yeah, and I mean, the short answer is I don't think anyone really has a strong argument other than it's going to circle around to this idea that every conference deserves to be included because, equity. But, the question of what happens when they get there, well, the casuals out there, to quote Josh Pate, are going to say, well, anyone can win. It's college football. Anything can happen on a given Saturday. I don't think that's true. I don't think Oregon's knocking off Ohio State this year. And it's one thing to say anything can happen when, number 6 Tennessee knocks off number 2 Alabama.
Right. At home by
6,
3.
Yeah, at home by 3. Okay, in a stretch where these teams are playing back to back to back, and Alabama played without their starting quarterback for a few weeks, and they were beat up after Texas A&M, and there's all these factors at play for these two teams. Yeah, it's a very different thing to play in the end of December or start of January with a month off, with nothing to do but to prepare for that other team and motivation to do so and to get healthy after you've had a whole season to get all your games figured out, and for those elite talent teams to get all those young players that have to rotate in because you have so many people you lose to the pros, to get them all settled and experienced to figure out your roster. Yeah, at that point, you want to go as Oregon and have a rematch or have a match against Ohio State. Yeah, good luck with that. That's not going to make for exciting television. No much as people want to say it will, you're going to end up with 2019 LSU, Oklahoma over and over and over and over again. And I know we've seen a lot of it, but just because we've seen a lot of it doesn't mean you can't see even more. Like it's a possibility. And in fact, I think in this sport in particular, when you look at elite teams, it's a very distinct possibility. But we've been over that soapbox enough that I don't need to hammer it home any more than I already have.
Christopher Art says, "What are your thoughts on Brent Venables' start?" I mean, I'm sort of like in the middle. In general, I think he's a great coach. And I think it was a great hire. I think that Oklahoma has not been a team of super high talent in a way that they could lose their coaching staff and lose a lot of talent off of that team that went to Southern Cal or that went elsewhere. Take all of those hits and still be a good football team in a league that's better. Like, Big 12 is better than it's been. It's better this year than it's been in the past, in my opinion. So they aren't afforded a down year where they can get some wins that look good to sort of cover some of that. But I also think that, like, Dylan Gabriel got hurt at a really bad time, and it's clear they don't have a backup quarterback solution there. But in general, I haven't seen anything from Oklahoma that tells me, oh, this was a bad hire.
Yeah, I mean they dropped 3 in a row before they beat Kansas. And look, let's be clear, after this week in particular, it's obvious that Kansas is not a great football team. The whole "you ain't played nobody" concept in college football exists for a reason. Your team is always going to be a reflection of the opponents you face. That's true of any sport, right? The reality is, a high school team may look like the greatest team ever when they play other high school teams, be it basketball, baseball, football, whatever. But college football is a bit unique in, I think, partly due to the roster sizes that are involved, partly due to the nature of the sport and how it operates. That problem permeates college football. And Kansas, blowing out Kansas a week ago or didn't really matter a whole lot, I don't think. They came back against Baylor, but they look pretty outmatched. And I don't know that Baylor team is necessarily too great. But I do think the problems that they had in the 3 weeks prior had a lot to do with Dylan Gabriel going out. It's clear without Gabriel, that offense has nothing. And it has a lot to do with all the players they lost with losing the coach to USC. We have opinions on that, and those opinions are not particularly positive for Lincoln Riley. It has a lot to do with where the defense is at. I mean, I don't think Venables is the reason that defense doesn't have any idea how to cover, how to tackle. We talked about the Texas game when they played them, that it didn't really matter what Texas did. Oklahoma, they were busting 2 or 3 coverages of play. It was almost comical. That's a long-term developmental problem. A little bit of it is people learning a new scheme, probably under Venables. It's a little more complicated, but it's also just guys not having a clue how to run coverage. It's players that were misevaluated coming into the program. They haven't been taught how to tackle. It's a multi-year rebuilding job that was accelerated due to the transfer portal. I don't have huge concerns with Venables. I think you've got to give him at least 2 to 3 years. And the fact that they are not good this year doesn't bother me when the problems they have, in particular, the fact that they don't have a backup quarterback, not something Venables created. The fact that the defense is bad is something that's been an issue for years at Oklahoma. I think you're just seeing what Oklahoma would have looked like if they didn't have Spencer Rattler or Caleb Williams last year, right? Like they probably would have been this bad. It doesn't really bother me too much. I think the future's still ahead of them as much as anyone else out there, and they just, they're just going to have to rebuild that roster.
Since we're doing a shorter show, I'm going to go ahead and remind you now to start working on your top 10 because I'm working on mine and I'm getting pretty close. So, MH said Illinois' defense is legit because we did talk about Illinois earlier. It might be legit. I just like we can pull it up real fast, but like, has Illinois played a bunch of good offenses? That's my problem with the Big Ten this year. Like, I have a huge problem with the way they're playing football because it's like for years we had all of these great quarterbacks coming out of the Big Ten. Like, we might have had good offenses in the Big 12 paired with bad defenses, but we had good quarterback play coming out of the Big Ten, good scheme coming out of the Big Ten. And I just don't feel it right now. Like the offenses Illinois has played are atrocious. Indiana, they lost to them. Virginia, terrible. Chattanooga, Wisconsin, terrible offense. Iowa, a joke of an offense. Wyoming and Minnesota. So I think that we did this with Kansas, Josh. We're doing it with Illinois. What we like to do is project onto these not so great brand names a lot of that they're maybe a little better than they actually are because it makes us feel good to think about it. When in reality, if we truly dissect how they're playing football, and this is where we get a lot of trouble with fan bases, we especially like Arkansas fans. They're not playing that great. A lot of times they are a product of their schedule. And look, Illinois being good for Illinois standards, how they have been, and the fact that they are 6-1, I think that's great. We said this about Kansas. Kansas, for who they compare themselves to in the past, they are great. But when we start talking about top 10 Kansas, great defense in college football, Illinois, I think that's where we got to pump the brakes a little bit.
Yeah, it's the problem we always run into, and we always run into this when we talk about top tens. And something I tweeted about, I guess out of frustration, and I'm going to cover 2 topics now. Is trying to deal with fans of fan bases that their teams are trying to build back up to that top tier. And the 2 in particular I would think of would be Penn State and Texas. And right now we have Penn State fans. Stephen Light said, "Hi, nerds. Sorry, I'm a quick visitor tonight. Have some Penn State recovery groups to attend. Thanks again for all your work." And Stephen's a huge supporter of the channel, which we appreciate. And yeah, they beat up on Minnesota, but this is the give and take, right? This idea that you're pretty good this year. You're a good football team. Being a good football team doesn't mean you're top 5. It may not mean you're top 10. And that's where Penn State has been operating year after year. And I'm reticent to put them on my top 10, and I take a lot of hate. And then they lose some games and everyone says they suck. And then they win a game and people say, well, maybe they should be. Like, they are a team, as I've said for a while, that is kind of hovering around top 15. I'm not hating. I'm just being realistic. Like, that is what they are. And if they were a better team, I would rank them better. It's tough sometimes when you try to have these honest takes that you take so much heat, because it'd be really easy for me to just say this undefeated team is great. We love them. They're the best team ever. And all the fans would come and cheer us on. And I try to be honest. And Texas is sort of the same boat for me. Quinn Ewers, I had this comment that I thought Quinn Ewers, if his first read is open, if he can make a point throw, that talent shines, and he's phenomenal. Like, as a pure talent, I can absolutely see why he was so well regarded from recruiting sites. I can see why he's going to be a phenomenal pro prospect. But as a college football player today, he looks like a freshman. And that was in games where, Texas was winning by large margins and people were upset about it. And today it came home to roost that Oklahoma State won that game. And why did they win it? Because Ewers was less than 50% passing. Why was he less than 50% passing? Because Oklahoma State defensively was able to take away that first read. And quite frankly, right now the Big 12 is playing really bad defensive football, so that's not going to happen all that often. And that's not just a cliche. They just are. But when his first read's gone, he does not know how to process things, and his footwork goes to crap, because when you have your first read and you can look at the guy and you can throw, you get your feet set, you turn, you wait, you throw. When he's covered, now you got to find the next guy, and you got to turn your body, and you got to reset your feet. You got to change your timing, make sure you hit your window. It's a whole different ball game, and that's where the progression and development comes in from quarterbacks, and Ewers just isn't there yet. But fans don't like to hear it. Along the same lines, that there's a lot of things in college football, and I just want to hit this because I think it's the funniest thing I've seen in a while. Paul Dodd in his super chat said Sean Clifford or good cotton candy, or no, excuse me, Sean. That was a really bad statement. Sean Clifford or good candy corn.
I'd take stale candy corn right now. I would take it.
I mean, Penn State looked pretty good tonight, but you can, like they're. Troy V, and just saw in the comment, I blame Josh for Penn State's fall. He is the floor and the ceiling. His floor is pretty good. He's going to run the offense to a degree where he's going to get you in the right plays, know what you're doing. Like, the run plays are more successful as a result from him. The offense is a little more consistent, and as long as you have an advantage, Sean Clifford's going to get you the win. But if Sean Clifford has to make point throws against covered receivers, you're in trouble. And that's the floor, the ceiling problem, and that's what Penn State's dealing with. And that's the problem with all the teams in these tiers. Same thing with really the opposite problem with Texas is that you see the ceiling with Ewers and everybody gets really excited. But today you kind of experienced the floor with a freshman, and he didn't play very well, and he missed a lot of deep throws, and he was off. And you can tell he wasn't used to playing in that kind of environment. And you see why teams and coaches don't really like starting freshmen in those situations. So those things are all tied together, and there are a lot of football teams that are growing, and Penn State is a very good football team. The recruiting continues to improve. They have room to improve. I don't know how much patience you have for Franklin at this point. Same thing with Texas. I think they're playing really good football. I think they're a top 10 quality team. I'm going to take one more super chat. I'm just trying to knock these out. Nikki G said, what's the best win so far in each of your opinions? Oregon looks good for a left coast team. Maybe I'm biased, but I'm curious where you think it ranks versus others. Well, the best win is Tennessee over Alabama, and the second best win may well be Alabama or Oklahoma State over Texas. Texas is a very good football team, but they're not 100% consistent. And I kind of worry a little bit because a lot of the pieces they have, like Worthy and Robinson, those pieces aren't going to be around forever, and they're going to have to keep building. But with recruiting, they're going to be able to do that. Penn State's in the same boat. They just don't have the same huge depth of talent that Texas has coming in.
But 46-point win over Oregon has got to be at worst the second best win of the year, right?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, it's definitely on up there, particularly with Oregon is where Oregon's doing the Pac-12. But this is the other problem. I talk a lot about silos in college football. We have this frequent thing that happens where you have a group of teams that all kind of play each other, and there was a silo that exists in the Pac-12 and the Big Ten with Washington State, and I think it's Stanford, Michigan State, a couple others, maybe Wisconsin's thrown in there, and all those teams that kind of turned out to be bad. But the thing is, those teams in the Big Ten are uncompetitive versus other Big Ten teams. And those teams in the Pac 12 have been highly competitive, like Washington State versus Oregon. I really think the Pac 12 may be quite bad. So beating Oregon in paper, it's the second best win. I could agree with that. At the risk of offending a lot of Pac 12 fans who are, it's only, oh gosh, it's only 8:30 there. Man, that's time zones are crazy. But that's just reality this year. Again, I call the shots like I see them. Even if I'm wrong, I'm always trying to be honest. I don't know that the Pac-12 is very good. So I think in paper, it's the second best win. I think in reality, Oregon might be like a team ranked from like 15th to 20th. I don't actually know if Oregon played Penn State, maybe this is the point I'll make. I don't know that I'd pick Oregon to win that game. And let me flip that question to you. If Oregon played Penn State today, who would you pick to win that game?
I'd pick Oregon because I think Oregon can score points, and I think that they're like I think they're better than losing by 46 to Georgia. That was Lanning's first game. Kirby knows that defense. Like I think there's a lot going on there. I think if they played today, I don't know that Oregon. I don't think Oregon loses by 46. I don't love Penn State, and I think Penn State's getting a lot of mileage out of the Auburn game, a game where their quarterback situation is terrible. But Clifford, I think, was over 10 yards an attempt there. But like tonight, even tonight, the touchdown to Washington was a terrible throw, and he just made a crazy play and adjusted. So it's tough for me to know where to peg Penn State. I am segue alert going to have them in my top 10. Are you ready to do a top 10? Do you have one? Do you think you can put one together while I do mine?
Yeah, I've got my top 10 together.
Okay. Do you want to do it now?
Sure, I'm ready.
All right. So I was out last week, didn't get to do a top 10, but I'm sure I'm back to piss all y'all off now. I've got Ohio State number 1. I don't know why the AP continues to have Georgia over Ohio State. And look, like, I think Georgia would maybe be a slight favorite over Ohio State on a neutral field right now? Yes. But it's got to be, when you're doing rankings, resume plus kind of that power ranking thing. And Ohio State hasn't really had the knucklehead game that Georgia had against Kent State, that Georgia had against Missouri. So I don't get that. I think today was dominant. Obviously, even in ugly, they looked ugly for a while. They won 54-10 or whatever. Georgia number 2. I think that for all of those issues of the ugly games, it's with these elite teams, it's like when they have to turn it on, they do turn it on. A lot of teams week in and week out, you see they're playing as hard as they can, maybe above their heads a little bit. And these elite teams, you give them a month to prepare, and they're just going to turn it on. So I got Georgia number 2. I've got Tennessee number 3. Basically a bye week this week, 65-21, I think, against UT Martin, the team from Tennessee that wears Auburn's uniform. The thing is, Josh, a lot of people are saying Alabama's a fraud, Alabama's trash, but they have Tennessee in the top 3. I've had Tennessee number 4 for a month now, so I was on that bandwagon early, and I'll continue to take credit for it. But if Tennessee is your number 3 team in the country, and they beat Alabama at home, so Alabama had to travel to Neyland Stadium. They committed 17 turnovers or 17 penalties, missed a game-winning field goal at the end of the game to lose that game to Tennessee, then Alabama's got to be right there. Alabama would be probably a 6-7 point favorite over Tennessee on a neutral field. Michigan number 4. This is more because right now I think Alabama's better than Michigan. I got them number 5. I think Alabama's better than Michigan, but I do want to reward Michigan for beating the crap out of Penn State, who is not an elite team, but I think is a good team. And I think Michigan deserves that credit because Alabama doesn't have that kind of win on their resume. And they could have done it tonight, but they messed around, stepped on their you know what's for basically the entire second half. Bryce Young looked really bad for a lot of this game. I know he does the run around wizard thing and he has some big plays and big moments, but they have no offensive identity. I feel like Alabama could score 75 or 17 against the same team in consecutive weeks. It's really weird, but they did have a dominant defensive performance. I've got Clemson at number 6. Everybody's going to keep Clemson up because they beat number 14 Syracuse. Syracuse has less talent on their team than Vanderbilt in terms of rankings and such. And DJU couldn't get it done today. If it was solely up to him, they would have lost that game. I don't think Clemson's great. I think they're the benefit of a weak schedule. They've got some issues defensively too. This is where it gets really tough for me. I've got Oklahoma State at number 7. I think Texas is a very good football team who also is a very flawed football team. And Oklahoma State hung in there and came back and won that game, I still think Oklahoma State has some defensive issues, but they did hold that Texas team to I think 3 points in the second half, and that 3 points came on a short field. Oregon number 8. I don't think they're a great team. I think that these next 3 show kind of what we talk about when we say the playoffs shouldn't be expanded. I've got Oregon number 8, and I don't think they're anywhere close to the top 5. Like I think Alabama would beat Oregon bad, and they're not even in my top 4 right now. That's why we're harping on this so much. One, it's really hard to do a top 10, especially with some of the parity we have down the line this year. And 2, the fact that we're having to put these teams in the top 10 just proves how absurd a 12-team college football playoff is. I've got Kansas State number 9. This is the team that maybe everybody would kind of raise an eyebrow at because they had that bad loss to a G5 team. But Kansas State has handled their business otherwise this year. And offensively has actually looked pretty good. So I'm going to reward them for that. And Wake Forest at number 10. While I don't think Clemson is great, I think that overtime loss to Clemson is their only loss. 3 top 10 teams lost today. I know there's going to be this pull to put USC back in the top 10 because they have 1 loss. They were only dropped to like 12th. I wouldn't do it. They should have lost a couple of games already this year. They haven't looked great offensively this year. I don't have USC in my top 10. I've got Wake at number 10. Really good offense, not great defense, but everybody's flawed down there at this point. Josh, give me yours.
Yeah, so my top 10, it's interesting. The top of it is pretty easy to suss out, and I think the rest of it gets more difficult. My number 1 is Ohio State, and Alex Rydell asked a super chat, is Michigan equipped to exploit Ohio State's weaknesses? It seems like Ohio State can finally stop the run. Does that end the conversation? And I don't think it ends the conversation, but it goes a long way because that highlights the differences. Ohio State is playing offensively not as consistently as they did last year. They did look shaky today. You can tell losing Wilson and Olave was something they could replace. Losing them and a healthy Smith and Jigba throws off the rhythm, and they kind of get back with it sometimes. And you could tell almost they were better off without him playing with a healthy set of receivers. But I don't think it's the same explosiveness. I think it had a lot to do with how tired Iowa got. But that is balanced by the fact that Ohio State can play very high-level defense. That gives them an edge right now, having what has been a consistently good offense and defense that no one else can really match. Even if they've had quarters where they don't appear, everybody else has had games where one side of the ball or the other hasn't looked good. So they're my clear number 1. Georgia's my number 2. I think they're still the more complete team than anybody else in college football. They're certainly one of the more talented. Even the games people talk about, Kent State game or the Missouri game, those were turnover-related games. There were games where they significantly really outperformed the other team per play for most of the game. They were still, I think, from a projection standpoint, a team that looks like they could play better, but just had a really bad day those days. And they still came out and they still won, and they still carried a multi-score lead for quarters of those games. Like Kent State, second quarter, they took a 2-score lead. They never relinquished it. They just didn't quite bury Kent State the way people would hope. That's still a very, very good football team. Michigan is my number 3. They look a lot like Georgia, but just, I think, frankly, just probably not quite as good a version of it. I like the explosiveness they found, but I also don't like how they sputter. I'm not going to punish them for having a bye week. They continue to be, an undefeated Michigan team that I think is very good. But I have a lot of the same concerns I had going into the playoff last year, where it's like Georgia, to me, just seems like a more athletic version than Michigan. It's just sort of rarefied air. Tennessee's my number 4. Beating Alabama is the best win anybody has in college football. Tennessee has a lot of top 25 wins. They have a good record. They have an offense that is probably second only to Ohio State's. And in terms of consistency and rhythm, I know people don't want to hear it. They might be better than Ohio State's. I don't think they have the same talent that Ohio State does, but they're performing on a more consistent basis. And it's not just the passing game. Their run game is very good. And when you combine the passing game with receivers with wide splits with a lot of speed, a quarterback that throws a great deep ball, and an interior run game that can really pound you up the middle to complement that with a really experienced offensive line, it's very difficult to stop. The problem in Tennessee is the defense is bad. It is bad. It's not good. The run defense is pretty good. The pass defense is bad. And that is going to kind of limit where I view them from a ceiling perspective, and probably going to end up biting them at some point this year. My next team, my number 5 team, is Alabama. And that Tennessee loss, as Daniel was saying, that Tennessee loss was a loss on the road at Tennessee in a game where Alabama had every chance at the end of the game to win the game. It's hard to drop them a lot more than that. As we often say, if you're number 2 and you lose in a last-second field goal to another team that is number 1, it's still reasonable to keep you number 2. And Alabama is sort of the beneficiary of that. They lost to a team that we legitimately think is a top 5 team. So it's hard for me to drop them a lot further than that, especially in view of the teams behind them, which, that we really quickly are getting to the point here where you're going to say these teams don't deserve to be in the top 10. Believe me, trying to put a team in instead, because the teams get really flawed really fast. Clemson is the next team. They narrowly beat Syracuse. They were down in that game. Now, Syracuse finally had a healthy starting quarterback. They've been a pretty good team with Schrader at times. But like Daniel said, it's not a talented team. Even with an offense with Schrader being pretty good, at the skill positions, they don't have much talent. They don't have receiver talent to really expose Clemson. If they did, I think Clemson would have been in a pretty darn big hole. And what really was disturbing to me, as much as DJU was not effective, was inaccurate, everything that he's been over the past couple of years from an inconsistency perspective showed up. It's the fact that they went to the freshman, and the freshman himself wasn't very effective. He was effective with his legs. He gave him a spark, but he wasn't particularly effective throwing the football. That offense still has problems, and the defense can be scored on, unlike the last few years. Clemson is a more vulnerable team, and I've said for a while they have the highest potential for a team outside that top group, but I don't know that they're going to hit it, and at this point, I don't think they will. I think they're a reasonably good team, and I almost worry that I have them ranked too high, to be honest. The team behind them, for me, is TCU. I think TCU has one of the top offenses in college football from a speed and talent perspective. They're very underrated. Duggan is playing at a high level. I do not like the defenses. I don't think TCU has a great defense. I've watched them for weeks now. Even in the Kansas State game, I think they've shown problems. And yeah, they played pretty well, but Martinez got banged up, didn't play the whole game. Like the Kansas game, right? Kansas is not a phenomenal football team. And that may have looked like a good win at the time, and I'm not really sure it was. But the offense is good enough right now, and high-level offenses are at such a premium that it keeps them in that slot, especially given their record. After TCU, in my opinion, it's kind of like the void or just sort of this quagmire of teams that all have major warts that you can throw in a pot. And the problem is the teams that have the best records, I don't necessarily view as being the best teams. The SEC has beat itself up quite badly. If you look through the roster, there are a lot of 2- and 3-loss teams in the SEC, and it makes it very easy to pick them apart, talk about why they're flawed, why a team like Kentucky doesn't need to be a top 10 team because of who they've lost to. But then you start getting into second level, comparisons, and it gets tough, right? Florida beat Utah. We want to talk about Utah as a top 25 team, and they were a top 15 team last week. Florida beat Utah, and Florida is on the bottom tier of the SEC really right now. So, is it really viable to have Kentucky at 19 at 5-2 and Utah at 15 at 5-2 the way the AP did last week? I don't really think so. I don't think it makes sense. I don't think you should be ranking Utah ahead of Kentucky, given what I've seen from those teams. But for these purposes in a top 10 world, I've got to give a lot of credence to the teams that only got one loss. And right now, Oklahoma State, with their win over Texas, gets my number 8 slot. I thought Texas was the team about to creep into the top 10. If they won, they would have been in my top 10. I think they're a top 10 quality team, but I think, like Daniel said, they're a flawed team. But Oklahoma State deserves credit for beating them. I think they were a good football team with a somewhat inconsistent offense and a good defense. Excuse me, a good defense, not a good defense, a pretty poor defense, gave up over 500 yards and gave up over 500 yards in a game where Ewers was playing really, really poorly, frankly. Texas had been clicking on all cylinders. They could have had 600 plus yards in that game. They could have easily outscored Oklahoma State. But that's enough right now to be at number 8. My number 9 is Oregon. For all my criticisms of Oregon, the fact that I don't think the Pac-12 is particularly good this year, they got one loss. And at this point, they're playing pretty good football. They're handling the teams in front of them. That's enough to be a top 10 team. And really the same thing Daniel said. I don't think they compete with Georgia or Ohio State or Alabama, but nobody does at this tier, not on a consistent basis. My number 10, it's really in the same boat as USC. I do not like putting USC in the top 10. Obviously, Oregon and USC are probably going to sort themselves out, but it's hard for me not to with one loss. I mean, if you go down and you look at the other teams available, I can't really put UCLA in after this week. I don't think Wake Forest is a great team. I've seen them play Vanderbilt and a couple others. I think they're kind of lucky the fact that Clemson is really not a great team, that they stayed in that football game. Syracuse was a bit of a pretender. Penn State is one that I have to throw around because of where they're at. Beating Minnesota pretty good. And that says a lot, right? They're Mississippi State loses. Kentucky sitting there. Illinois sitting there that I don't think is a great team. It's a quagmire. And quite frankly, it's hard for me to remember a year where from the rankings from a quality perspective and the rankings from an AP perspective are so different. And it has to do with the fact that really, I think the conferences have as much differentiation as they've ever had. I think the SEC and the Big Ten are a good clip above the rest of the conferences in college football right now. They're beating themselves up. But they're beating themselves up and getting bad records with teams that would probably blow out a lot of teams in other conferences. BYU gets blown out by Liberty. Cincinnati is high in rankings. Arkansas beat Cincinnati. Arkansas beat and blew out BYU. And nobody's considering Arkansas for a top 25 ranking. That's kind of the problem. So that's how I ran out my top 10. And yeah, that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, and you probably heard me while I was doing mine, and you wanted to save me from screwing up on the TCU Kansas State thing. Guys, after looking at this, I did not see that final. And that's the problem with doing these live and not getting time to digest everything. So my apologies on that. Obviously, I would have TCU where Kansas State is. Maybe even ahead, because I have Kansas State further down. So I'd probably have TCU right at that 7 spot. Like you, I really like their offense. I'm concerned with their defense, but obviously clean record. And I think that, we said the TCU Oklahoma State winner is going to be at least playing for that Big 12 championship. But TCU's put themselves in a position to, down the stretch, like they can even, in my opinion, afford a loss and still make the playoffs. Somebody asked earlier up the line, Josh, if Georgia beats Tennessee, which would mean Tennessee's 11-1 at the end of the year, and Alabama beats Georgia, you've got two 12-1s and 11-1. Is it going to be Ohio State, Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama in the playoffs? I don't think that would ever happen in a 14 playoff, but I would also argue that if Georgia beats Tennessee in a close game, there is an argument to be made that those are the 4 best teams in the country.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's a really significant argument. People talk about expansion for a 12-team playoff to give inclusion. This year in particular, if you were to go to a 12-team playoff, the odds of you getting a Final Four that are 2 to 3 SEC teams are extremely high. Like the odds of you getting an all SEC, 3 SEC teams in the semis and an all SEC final out of a 12-team playoff really stinking high. It just it is what it is, and you can like it or you can dislike it, but it is what it is. And these teams are going to play. A lot of them are going to play throughout the year, and some of them are going to make the playoff. I don't know quite how it's going to work, but it feels like you're going to get 2 SEC teams in the playoff. And when you do, I think you're going to get one Big Ten team that has a fighting chance and somebody else that's just going to be a sacrificial lamb for whoever they get slotted against with 2 SEC teams filling it.
Yeah, and I think fighting chance is a little rough because Ohio State's my number 1 right now. So I don't think it's a fighting chance. Kind of implies that they're a scrappy underdog. But
probably not the right wording, but you got my point. Like there's going to be a Big Ten team. There's going to be a Big Ten team with a realistic chance to win the championship. Is what I mean by that. With 2 SEC teams with a realistic chance to win the title, and then some 4th team that gets slotted in because record it's just going to get
right.
Whether they play Ohio State or the SEC team is just going to get run out of the building. That was my point.
Somebody made a joke up the line that Clemson's undefeated season is going to ruin it. And we've seen Clemson do this in the past. Like 2017, Clemson had a clean record, won their conference championship, and had no business in the playoffs. But we've seen that with Oklahoma. Like we've seen that with teams before in the past. And part of it, Josh, is, and this is why I wouldn't put 3 SEC teams in the playoffs. Part of it is at some point, like you talk about too, once you lose, you take that sort of control your own destiny out of the equation and leave it up to the people that are making these decisions. I think at some point, if you finish second in your division and you don't play for a championship and the other 2 teams have a clean record, then you just have to accept fate that like you got eliminated when you lost one of those games. And we can't have 3 SEC teams in the playoffs because we also don't know what we don't know about the SEC either.
Right. Well, this is the great irony that I've always pointed out with playoff expansion. And it's this assumption that if you do playoff expansion, that you bring more teams in and that inclusion somehow going to create more varied results. My argument has always been for the opposite. And I think the reality is by having it smaller, we've kept out a lot of teams. Like this year, you're not going to get 3 SEC teams in the playoff. It's just not going to happen. And it's very difficult for a conference to get 2 teams in the playoff. It's just not going to happen. It's because right now you lose your division, you don't make the conference championship game. Stuff's kind of out of your hands, right? You make the conference championship game and you lose, then suddenly you get into this weird game. And I do think if Georgia goes undefeated and then Alabama gets in the conference championship game and beats them, you're probably going to get Alabama and Georgia because they're not going to take a Georgia that they're not going to take Tennessee, who lost to Georgia, over Georgia, who had to play an extra game after an undefeated regular season. That would make no sense. So it would be those 2. But that's kind of the thing. It keeps Tennessee out because, the conference championship and the divisional races are a playoff. And those games matter and the losses matter. You expand the playoff, it doesn't really matter. These 3 teams are very likely all going to make it to the playoff. And at that point, it's just, everything's wiped clean. It doesn't matter that Tennessee beat Alabama really, other than seeding. And so, any one of them can win. And the reality there is that probably all 3 of them, depending on how they're seeded versus other conferences and other conference teams with records, actually are going to advance. So you're better off in a 14 playoff, at least keeping Tennessee out. Whereas in a 12-team playoff, you only assume it's better if you don't assume that Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee don't all win their round 1 games versus Big 12 or Pac-12 teams or what have you. Because I think it's actually more likely that you end up with those 3 teams in, Ohio State / Michigan as your 4-team finalists. Or you get that stupid Ohio State Georgia game or something like that. I think even worse, you might get that in round 2 and your second best team could get eliminated in round 2 because we seed it stupidly because the current format demands that conference champions make the top 4, which means Alabama wins the SEC. Georgia and Tennessee are going to be number 5 and 6. So now the whole seeding tree is really screwed up. And one of them could easily end up playing Ohio State or Michigan in a mid-tier round. And you might see the number 1 or number 2 team go down in a mid-tier round, which I don't think is good.
Yeah.
That's why you always need to rank and place 1 through 12 in terms of who should be number 1 and who should be number 12 without regard to conference championships or automatic slots. the moment you do that and you start putting the second best team as number 5, there is a tree and a seating structure, and now you can have the 2 best teams in the same tree, and that's not good. That's not a good way to do it.
And I know we gotta wrap this up because we were trying to go just an hour since we started late. But I want to say that the 12-team playoff is just an expansion of the thing that they keep asking us to do, and that's pretend that we don't know what we don't know. Pretend that a team that lost by 46 has not just belongs there, but has earned a spot to play among the teams that are there. The 12-team playoff thing, Josh, what's funny about it this year is if like Ole Miss only loses to Alabama down the stretch, we could literally have 2 Big 10 teams and 4 SEC teams filling up half the field. And they would all be favored. All of them would be favored against anybody else they play. And they would be lower seated. So like Tennessee would be playing, and Georgia in this scenario would be playing conference champions, but as a lower seed, which is just absolutely bonkers to me. I just don't need if Clemson lost today but won their conference, I don't need to see a team that really almost lost to Syracuse today. I don't need to see them seeded number 3 and Georgia seeded number 6 because Georgia happened to play Alabama and lose in the SEC championship game. It's silly.
Yeah. Mike Farino said, so there are a couple more super chats to try to burn through. 4 best teams right now are 2 Big 10 teams and 2 SEC teams. And it's hard to disagree with that. It seems like Ohio State, Michigan, and 2 SEC teams, which are some combination of Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia, are your 4 best teams. And you could probably say they're the 5 best. To our point earlier, Tennessee beat Alabama and deserved to be ahead of them in the rankings. I don't know. That was a really tight game. I don't know if I'd pick Tennessee to win if we had to see them play again, especially in a neutral site. But it seems like those teams are well ahead, especially with the way Clemson's played this week, where I thought if they're going to turn a corner, it seemed like this was the week to do it, and then went the opposite direction. These teams seem way ahead of everybody else. Brian Laguerre, and I apologize if I mispronounced it, said, what if Michigan loses to Ohio State by 1 score? And yeah, I mean, the Big Ten could get 2 teams in the playoff. Absolutely. And that's,
I'm not putting Michigan, Josh, I'm not putting Michigan in over a 1-loss Tennessee or Georgia.
Due to schedule. I was about to say that the scheduling is the problem for Michigan in particular, but I'll let you finish.
Yeah. I mean, and we've been on this all year. If we let, so beating, in this case, Tennessee would have beaten a number 1 Alabama who ended up being number 1 because they won out. So they beat the number 1 team in the country, or they beat a team that finished number 2 or number 3 in the country. Michigan would have played one of those and lost, and that's it. And they had an opportunity to play UCLA and beat them bad and didn't. I have a problem. There is no argument because you're going to have the SEC team in that scenario, and I'm not saying this because I'm an SEC wonk. I'm saying this because just pure math. In that scenario, either Tennessee or Georgia would have had a better win, and they would have had a probably significantly tougher strength of schedule, especially Tennessee, and would have either had to play Alabama in the SEC championship game to get their first loss, or have lost to the ultimate number 1, which would be Georgia or Tennessee in that scenario. Instead, Michigan played 3 of the worst teams in the country out of conference, and their only good win would be the Penn State game. So I would have a really hard time in that scenario just because of math. And if you flipped it and made that be the resume of Tennessee or Alabama or Georgia, I would say the same thing in Michigan's favor.
Yeah, it's actually very hard. I said it's possible for them to get in, but it's very hard for them to get in over the SEC teams because the SEC is going to be a situation with Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee where you need them to lose to someone other than each other. Because if Alabama runs the gauntlet, they're going to win the SEC West. Georgia and Tennessee play each other. One will win, one will lose. And so you're going to have, in that situation, you have an undefeated SEC East champion, one loss Alabama. If Alabama wins, they go. The SEC East loser is probably going to go over Michigan because their only loss is going to be to a very highly ranked team in the conference championship game. If Alabama loses, then you have, a Georgia and Tennessee whose only loss is to each other and the other one's undefeated. And if it's Tennessee, for example, their win is over Alabama, so they're going to go. So if it's Georgia, they beat Oregon out of conference, so they're going to go. So it's very, very hard for Michigan to get over those. But the point I was thinking of, Daniel, really was there's a very realistic possibility that you don't have a one-loss champion in the other conferences, or it might be like a one-loss Oregon, which would be sketchy. But I think it's, you either have an SEC team that has 2 losses as your second-ranked team, which is what you really need to root for if you're a Michigan and Ohio State fan, because it opens up your possibilities. Or also, you may not really have a decent candidate come out of the other conferences, the Pac-12 or the Big 12, which could actually end up in the really strange scenario of having 2 Big Tens and 2 SECs. Man, that would be a riot. But from a public perspective, but I think it's actually pretty realistic this year. Len, let me throw one more super chat here before we wrap up, Daniel. Matt Tripp asked, Daniel, do you like Rise? If so, where can I send you a bottle? Also, what are you sipping on tonight? So I know that one's close to your heart.
Yeah. Currently Russell's Reserve Single Barrel. I do like Rise. Because it's so tough to get the Wild Turkey Rare Breed, the regular, I will get the rye sometimes, and it's just as good. So yes, I do like Rise. We need to set up a PO box, Josh, to get stuff. We just do. We've been talking about it for years. We got to set that up. I do want to address one comment, Josh, because it's like near and dear to my heart when people make this absolutely stupid argument. And I appreciate John for being on the live show, but he made an argument that I absolutely despise, and I hope he comes back because I love you anyway. My dude, Tennessee just played an FCS school in October. You can't tell me that Tennessee just had such a crazy schedule that they're self-evidently belong in the playoffs. One, no, because we don't know what everybody else is going to do. In the scenario we're talking about, we have a Tennessee team who is 11-1 and lost to either beat the eventual number 1 or beat the eventual number 3, right? So they have a top 3 at end of season win. They've played Georgia, LSU, Florida, Kentucky, and the part of their schedule that they could control, they played Pitt, not an FCS quality Hawaii, UConn, or Colorado State, and dumping and canceling a series with UCLA. So this whole notion that if you play the Patriots 11 times in a row, but you also play a FCS school late, that means that your schedule is easier than someone that played the 75th toughest schedule in the country is absolutely insane. And I hate it because we're picking out one game and saying, okay, you can't be, as an elite team, you played an FCS school and beat them by 60 or whatever. And we played a team that Vanderbilt beat 63-10. It doesn't matter, guys. A really bad bottom of the barrel G5, the 130th best team in the country, is going to lose by 50 to anybody in the top 40 regardless. So a team that loses by 50 that just happens to be in Division I football versus a team that loses by 50 that's in the FCS, both teams are going to see the other team rest their starters at the half. The same thing plays out. And this thing that okay, Tennessee's playing Georgia and Alabama in this scenario. Even though the rest of their schedule is tougher, they're playing Georgia and Alabama in this scenario. The fact that they play an FCS team, they have one bad team on their schedule, negates the fact that they're playing top two teams. That is absolutely ridiculous. Michigan has one of the weakest schedules in the country. Most of it is not their fault. The thing that is their fault is scheduling Hawaii or UConn, who didn't even play in 2020, and dumping the game with UCLA. That is their fault, and they should be called on the carpet for it. But even if it's not their fault, Tennessee can't help that South Carolina sucks this year. They can't help that Kentucky isn't as good this year. just like Michigan can't help it. But the reality is Michigan's schedule is easy this year, save the Ohio State game. So if they lose that game, then they have an 11-game schedule where they played one ranked team, and that's Penn State. That's it. One ranked team. So you don't get to pick out the one weakest game on somebody else's schedule and say that it invalidates all the other top 10 and top 5 teams they play. It's absolutely ridiculous. I wish fans would stop doing it. People are doing it to Ohio State right now. I think it's crazy. That's the end of my rant. And we're 18 minutes late. So Josh, give me your piece and then we can wrap it up.
Yeah. If you're an elite team, you're defined by your hardest games, usually your hardest 4 to 6 games in the schedule. You almost are never going to lose to anyone beyond a top 40 team. Even your great upsets, Ohio State versus Purdue or Iowa, that was like a 26th ranked team and like a 45th ranked team in most advanced metrics in terms of quality. You're not going to lose to a team in the bottom half of college football. You're just not. And even you talk, well, Alabama struggled with Texas A&M, and they're not a great team. Yeah, they're not a great team. They're still like probably in the 30s overall in quality, because there's really no one in the SEC that's that bad. And Appalachian, they lost to Appalachian State. Yeah, Appalachian State's probably in the top half of college football. They're probably in like the 30s or 40s. So, when you have that conversation and you're one of those teams, the odds of losing to a bad team are so low. And if you're trying to go 7-5 or 8-4, yeah, what your every win matters and every loss matters. And the more decent teams you have on your schedule, the harder it is to go 8-4. To make a bowl game, if you're, I don't know, Nebraska, right? Like, it helps when you have an FCS team if you're trying to go 6-6. But if you're trying to go undefeated, it's a completely different conversation. It's about what are the hardest games in your schedule, not what the easiest ones are. And I'm going to turn to rankings real quick with Brian Fremeau just to sort of tie a bow on it. And he does a ranking that's based off this concept, right? That the difficulty of a schedule depends on how good you are playing as a football team. So if I'm an elite team, the more difficult schedule is going to be a schedule that's loaded with really high level teams, even if, half the schedule is garbage, because I'm going to beat that other half, whether they're 60th or 90th. It doesn't matter. If I'm a bad team, then yeah, I care whether they're 60th or 90th, because I'm just trying to scrape by and get 4 wins in the season. So I care about my worst teams. And in the elite schedule ranking, which is basically a ranking of how well you would do versus if you were an elite team versus that schedule. Right now, Ohio State is 82nd in the country in strength of schedule. Michigan is 53rd. Tennessee is 14th. And Alabama is 8th. The outlier right now is Georgia, who's 80th, still higher than Ohio State. But again, in the scenarios we're talking about, Georgia's going to have to play Tennessee and Alabama, which from an elite perspective, those are 2 very losable games. And so their strength of schedule is going to skyrocket by the end of the year. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of where we're at. And I'll wrap up. James Gazaway said, Christ is king, go dogs. Go dogs. Appreciate it. We always appreciate the comment. Christ is king. We always try to sign off with God bless. So we appreciate the positive comment. Nikki G said, what size hat? I'm seconding the P.O. box. Also thinking about stuff for Josh, but I'm an enigma. That's funny. I don't know what I need either. I think my wife would agree with you, honestly, because it's actually my birthday today. So that's your fun comment for the day. And Mike Farino said, here's some good context for Michigan's out of conference. According to Bill Stale's Vegas rankings, Ohio State's worst out of conference would be favored by 10 over Michigan's best. And yeah, that's a good way of doing it. But Michigan's out of conference schedule is one of the weakest out of conference schedules for a major playoff contender since. There was a point where the Big 12 had some with the 2014 season, for example, where you had like BC, I think it was Baylor played like 2 FCSs or something. And they weren't playing any P5s out of conference, either one of them, for a few years. And that's where Michigan's at, because they backed out of the UCLA game. So anyway, that's my piece, and that's me trying to wrap up the super chat. So I appreciate everything, guys. And we'll think about, like Nikki and everyone else, we'll think about the P.O. box and see if we get something wrapped up there.
Yeah. What you can do is, and I'm not going to do a sponsor ad read right now, but when we have a sponsor, and we got a new one, I think, coming up soon, you can, reach out to them and and kind of take care of them too, which takes care of us. But also, we will set up a PO box so we can get stuff from y'all, fan mail, and the like. All right, this has been a lot of fun. We're going to try to do this, I think, next week as well. Just kind of see how it goes. We're going after the big night game, although this one wasn't huge, and I think next weekend isn't huge either. It helps some of that attention clear out and come to us instead. And we love talking with you and chatting with you. So thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. Look forward to some previews from us this week. And